we talked a little bit last night in the car about this issue of why one would write and how what's how we might perceive ourselves as writers. And for me, I had kind of a misguided idea of how important a writer might be, but maybe from coming of age in the '60s when Vonnegut was such a huge presence, and Mailer and Vidal would be fighting on talk shows, and so I had this kind of romantic idea that if you were a good enough fiction writer, the culture would kind of turn to you in its hour of need. What do you think? What should we do? That hasn't exactly been the case. But so in some ways, my experience of getting published and so on has been a little bit, I wouldn't say, it's been surprising in terms of how indifferent the culture is to fiction at this point. Let's be frank about it. That, and I'll sort of state this thing in two ways. I'll overstate it in two directions. So here's the negative. The whole culture is much more interested in movies and music than they are in literature. Consequently, there's been a rise of this cult called the MFA, where all of us losers can go to Huddle for Warmth and get our little grants and so on. While meanwhile, the culture ignores us, and we get a little angry about it. And our work gets more and more insular and less relevant to our aunts and uncles who are worried about why we're doing what we're doing. It gets reflexively dark, doesn't have any real life in it, and it soon goes away. Excuse this, of poetry. So in other words, there's a vision of writers somehow having fallen off the mainstream and become marginalized, and in a sort of vicious cycle, the culture's ability to read our text is diminished. So we have to get even stupider, And so that's one route. Now, do I believe it? No, actually, I don't. But you probably have felt that yourself at times, this sense that literature is a kind of a little bit like classic jazz. It's become a bit of a museum piece. And the reason for we have MFA programs like I have at Syracuse is kind of to protect the flame a little bit, to try to instill real standards and keep the pure vision alive. Okay, that's one vision of it. The other part of it that I feel equally strongly about is that, in fact, what we're doing is far from hopeless. When you have a chance like I do to go around to places and meet writers, they're still the most incredibly interesting, intense people on the planet are people who are intensely involved with literature, with sentences. And in this model, we might want to reconstrue our idea of influence instead of saying, well, like my books stated, they don't sell that much. I think my biggest selling book is maybe 50,000, which is nothing. But then if we all think back to the first book we read that kicked our ass, you recognize that influence is not linear in that way. If you have, I would say, if you have 1,000 people reading a deep literary text that moves you in the way that only that can, it inspires your compassion and your empathy and wakes you up in the way that only a novel can or short story, then multiply that times 10,000, that's a lot. Especially when you consider that the people who are presently engaged in literature are actually really incredible people. I mean, in general, they're people who are particularly switched on, particularly curious, particularly energetic about reorienting their minds. So you might have 90 million people watch Everybody Loves Raymond, but it's like duck shit. I mean, it comes in and goes out. No offense, Raymond, but basically, we have had, all of us. You wouldn't be here if you hadn't had a handful of experiences where a book got into your head and your heart and changed everything. Changed the way the world looked. So I think that the way I encourage myself to go on is to say, well, if you could, write a story, and if 100 people of this sort of select type of person read it and were moved, that's a huge thing to do in the world. And it's not without a ripple effect sort of consequence. And finally, for me to I had a chance to do some movie writing and other kinds of writing, and at the end of the day, there's that beautiful feeling for me in a short story of fully being myself. Not just the self I happen to be today, but through the miracle called rewriting, I can manifest on that story literally thousands of times, tweaking it and changing it. And at the end, that story is more me than I am, you know. So even if all the readers in the world washed away and it was just me and my mother, you know, I would still want to experience that feeling of taking a story and moving it along its own arc, and in that process becoming more fully myself, you know. So I actually do kind of find myself operating between those two poles. On the one hand, a little bit of disappointment that what we do isn't more valued and more mainstream, but secretly very delighted that I get to do it at all, and that you know, when I go out on trips like this, you always meet the most extraordinary readers. You know, people who really have taken the trouble to read your work and have found something in it. And so somewhere between those two poles, I think, you know, during the Iraq War, I had an idea that, you know, I thought, God, you know, if these morons, and I won't name them morons, but there was a lot of morons talking at that time in favor of violence and in favor of kind of an American arrogance, then why are we so quiet? You know, some of the smartest people I know, writers like Tobias Wolff, for example, a genuinely wise man, you know, Robert Stone, Alice Munro, all these people that I've met who are just so extraordinary. And I noticed that the culture wasn't turning to them to say, what do you think about the Iraq invasion? It was almost like that would be silly, you know. Well, in my experience, it would be really smart, you know, to go to the smartest, most experienced people in your culture and ask, well, they weren't. So then I thought, well, shoot, you know, if I get a chance to be at all public, I'm going to try to do it. So, and when this Brain Dead Megaphone book came out, I got to do some TV things. And I thought, okay, it's in the spirit of Gore Vidal and Norman Mailer and the public intellectual. And it turned out to be weird, actually, you know, kind of, and it left a bit of a bad taste in my mouth. So now I'm back to my writing room and just writing short stories for the rest of my life, I hope. But anyway, that's kind of where I find myself at this moment in terms of, you know, what I think we're doing and why we're doing it.